Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. Today we have the third video in our short series on interpreting Renaissance fencing diagrams, paying particular attention to Giacomo di Grassi's book of 1570. Today's video will also feature a diagram from Achilles Marozzo's earlier work of the 1530s. More about that later in the video. Okay, I'm not holding a sword in my hand today because the topic this time is footwork. So we're going to look at the principal footwork diagram from di Grassi's book, which is this one. It's kind of a crude drawing in some ways, but it does actually contain a lot of very useful information for learning the footwork system specifically required in di Grassi's fencing system. So let's go through this diagram step by step and see what it means. Firstly, you'll notice there is a fencer stood on a principal straight line this way, marked A, B. So this is literally labelled in the diagram the linea retta, so the straight line, or you could think of it as the direct line. So this is a kind of axis along which fencing mostly takes place. So I'm going to align myself with the diagram so that I can explain this a bit more clearly. So if I face my imaginary opponent this direction, I'll just take a diagonal step back with my left foot, which will put me in a generic guard stance. So in this position, my front foot is currently at point C, somewhere in the middle of that central axis. My opponent is off in the direction of point A, and point B is somewhere directly behind me. So if I move my back foot forwards to point D on the diagram, I'll end up here with a kind of reverse stance. So this is a full step forwards along a straight line, so it is a full straight step. So once again, front foot on C, back foot in the guard position. There's my full step forwards, point D, point C. If I want to take a half step instead, then my back foot moves by half the distance. So I'll end with my feet both at or close to point C, like so. Half steps are usually chained together in a little sequence. So if I take a second half step, then one of my feet, in this example, the right foot this time, will move forward by the half distance again. And I'll end with my right foot on point D this time, and my rear foot on point C. So this is a second half straight step. And to go backwards, of course, I just reverse the motion of these. So I pull the front foot back to point C, that's a half step, and then I return the rear foot to the guard position. And here I am, back in the original stance. Okay, you will also see there is a diagonal line heading off to the left, marked E and F. So if I travel along this line, I will form what can either be called an oblique step or a slope step. So if I move my left foot out to point E, the furthest one, like so, I have formed a full oblique step or full slope step. And similarly, if I move it to point F, which is roughly level with point C, but on the diagonal, I will have formed a half slope step or half oblique step, like so. Finally, we have this curved line heading off in the other direction to my right-hand side. So this represents a circular step with the rear foot swinging behind us to land at or near point G. Circular step is always considered a half step. Now what this means is the rear foot does not pass in front of the lead foot. In other words, it doesn't go forwards of the C position on the diagram. So at most it lands parallel with it or a little behind. So circular step looks like this. My rear foot has swung around to point G and my front foot stays on point C. So once again, this is my guard stance, front foot on C, circular step, back foot on G, front foot still on C. So those are the specific steps which are encapsulated in this diagram. There is one more useful step in the treatise, which is the extended step, which is the normal way we launch attacks. There are exceptions. You can launch attacks with the other steps on occasion as well, but the main attacks are with the extended step, which is where we move the front foot forwards about 1 foot length in front of C in the direction of D, like so. So this is the extended step. This is not directly shown or labelled on the diagram, but essentially it just means moving the front foot forwards along the main axis AB in the direction of our opponent out towards A. So once again, guard stance, front foot on C. There's the extended step moving along the straight line. So that's what the diagram's showing us. The accompanying text says that you can use these steps in various different combinations to move around in any direction you want. 360-degree field of movement is available to you. So these steps are very useful to combine with defensive actions for deflecting aside attacks and dodging out the road at the same time, but also for kind of zigzagging forwards, looking for an opening, an angle past your opponent's defense where you can subsequently launch that extended step through the hole in the defense to strike the target. So there's actually a lot of information in that diagram. It's not the best looking diagram in the world, but it actually has really everything you need to know about the Grassi system. So let's compare that now with Achilles Marozzo's footwork diagram from his earlier treatise from the first half of the 16th century. So Marozzo's diagram looks like this. So first thing to say is it's a much nicer diagram, it's better drawn, has this very pleasing geometrical pattern in the middle of it. So much nicer to look at. Maybe not immediately so obvious as Grassi what it's showing, so let me talk you through it. So we can see there's a small circle in the middle, a large circle around the outside, and then we've got the arms of this kind of star shape projecting between the two levels of the circle. In the diagram we can see that the two fences are close enough to have their swords crossed, what Grassi would call being at the half sword, mezza spada. So what does all this mean? Okay, so essentially the fencers here are at what we might call narrow measure, or in Marozzo's terms, they're engaged in narrow play, gioco stretto. So yeah, they're close enough to interact in a very strong way with their swords and actually to strike each other with short movements. If these fencers were at the wide measure, then they would be stood on the rim of the circle, of the large circle, rather than inside it. So as it is, they're kind of between the two circles, which indicates narrow measure. The small circle in the middle would represent coming to grips, so that's wrestling distance, where the fences are really close, face to face. The arms of the star are how Achilles Marozzo represents the possible footwork. So you'll see right now that the fencers are on opposing, directly opposing arms of the star. So in effect, this is showing us the linea retta, the straight line or direct line, which we saw from Grassi's diagram. So they're directly facing each other. And the other arms of the star are kind of angling out to either side. So if the fencer on one side takes a step towards the perpendicular arm, he's going to step round like this, which is the same as de Grassi's slope step or oblique step. The full slope step or full oblique step. And if the fencer steps to the intermediary arm, then he's taken the equivalent of a half slope step or oblique step, however you prefer. And of course, we've got the same going in the other direction as well. So we could swing the back foot around to reposition us there. Marozzo also has something like a slope step going in this direction, moving this foot out towards the intermediary arm. And it's possible to chain together all these movements in different ways to maneuver yourself around. Again, there's a lot of information contained within that diagram, but as we can see, it's actually quite similar information to de Grassi's one. Now, Marozzo and de Grassi's systems are not the same. There are notable tactical differences. De Grassi is very much more thrust oriented, while Marozzo is definitely a cut and thrust system. It's also very likely that de Grassi was using a longer, heavier sword than Marozzo. However, it is my personal belief that de Grassi's newer approach to fencing in the late 1500s was built on top of a foundation of the earlier stuff from the first half of the 16th century, the cut and thrust style, because the body posture and the footwork is very similar. So I think from that point of view, it's interesting to look at these two diagrams together and understand that they are somehow related to each other. Now, one final note about Marozzo's diagram. I like this for two reasons. One, it is aesthetically pleasing, but two, Marozzo actually advised using this in a really practical way. So he recommends in his book that excuse me, that fencing instructors actually mark out or draw this symbol on the ground in the fencing cell so that fencers can physically pace through it and do training drills on it to learn the footsteps in an accurate way. And this is a really interesting idea for me. I would really like to try it sometime, but unfortunately have not had the opportunity to do so thus far. However, I think it is just nice to think about how in Renaissance culture people were taking these mathematical or geometrical ideas and really applying them to fencing, both in theory and in practice. So that tells us something culturally interesting about the swordsmanship of the era. It was very definitely an attempt to make it rational and scientific in its approach. So I think that's important to bear in mind. We need to have an idea of the society and the culture in which our fencing systems were born, to really understand why they were arranged and constructed and explained in the way that they were. So that's really the overarching theme for today's video. But from a practical point of view, these diagrams obviously can be a useful mnemonic aid, a memory aid to remembering how to move around. That's it for today. I will finish up there and I will return shortly with the next video in the sequence. Until then, take care everyone. See you next time.